for tuning in, either being in Washington or virtually. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the members who are not on the subcommittee but want to sit in be permitted to do that at today's hearing and also ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, please keep your microphones muted unless speaking. Should I hear any advertent background noise, I'll request that the member please mute their microphone. To insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentsTI@mail.house.gov. Before I begin, I'd like to just take a moment of personal privilege to tell you all that Aaron Davis is leaving our committee. I hate to hear that because he's been a great member of this team and certainly an asset to me and all of us, providing excellent information. Aaron's been 3 years on the T&I committee. He spent 4.5 years at FEMA and brought that experience with him to the committee. And he served 11 years in different personal house offices. He's moving to become the Vice President of Federal Government Affairs at the International Code Council. And they are lucky to have him. He certainly has a lot of background in this area. I think we'll still be seeing Aaron, but now he'll be sitting across the table from us instead of behind the podium. So Aaron, we wish you all the best and we thank you for all that you have done for this committee. And we look forward to interacting and working with you in your new role. I'll now start with my own statement and then we'll go to Mr. Webster, the ranking member, for his. Welcome today, our witnesses. This is a very important hearing because we're going to be discussing what should be the priorities of FEMA moving into 2022. When we think about FEMA, we typically think about floods or hurricanes or wildfires or those kinds of immediate disasters that are usually limited to a specific area. But what we have learned with the National Disaster Declaration during COVID-19 is that unexpected events of all kinds can impact any community at any time. Now, during this declaration, which is ongoing, people in Nevada, and I'm sure in all of your states, have really relied on FEMA to provide certain services that perhaps they haven't in the past, like setting up community vaccination centers. In addition to the pandemic, we know that the climate change and severe weather events, which have combined with high-risk areas having more intense development, to really make emergencies more serious. They have changed the emergency management landscape as a result, and government and insurance data show that these disasters are more expensive and have a greater impact than ever before. And that's what we need to talk about as we look at FEMA's plans for the next year. We need to see how FEMA can adapt to this new reality in dealing with certain kinds of disasters and with those that are unexpected, and how they can keep our communities and the survivors as a priority as they move forward. The demand for public assistance has never been greater. We see it, they want to help repair public infrastructure after a disaster. That has just increased at rocket speed as the intensity of natural disasters have also increased. And presently, FEMA has the longest queue for public assistance to date as a result of these disasters. You only have to look at Puerto Rico if you don't believe me, because they are still trying to get public assistance for the people who were affected by the weather conditions in those areas, as well as in the Virgin Islands. Reimbursements are critical from FEMA to these communities to get back on their feet. But one of the things that we have heard over the years and the time I've chaired this committee is there's just too much red tape, too many burdensome requirements. People don't know where to apply. It's contradictory information. So that's got to be a priority, that we clean up that red tape and simplify the public assistance program to better assist our communities. The second thing that I know we want to talk about that should be a priority is the workforce. two things are happening at the same time. It's difficult to find people to work, and yet the disasters are increasing. So how do we find additional team members to work with the men and women who have done such a good job and worked so hard in these kind of trying times in order to expand the workforce there? We need more diversity. We need more longevity of the members. We need to be able to attract well-qualified workforce to FEMA. And so that's got to be a priority. I've got legislation that's bipartisan, which will be introduced, designed to help FEMA meet these needs to retain and to recruit and retain qualified reservists. We need to provide protection for these folks. We need to provide training, and we need to provide benefits if we want to have a team who can meet the new demands. A third issue that seems to run throughout the priorities that FEMA should be looking at for the new year is the notion of building resilience. When you build back, you need to build back better. And so I'm proud to have championed some efforts along with the chairman of this committee, Mr. DeFazio, and the resilience package so that we could provide some of this assistance. And we also sent a letter to FEMA talking about inequitable distribution of benefits that need to be considered. So I look forward to working with FEMA on these efforts during 2022. This committee stands ready to do what Congress can to assist FEMA's efforts. We want to hear how the FEMA is trying to meet the 50 open recommendations that have come from the GAO that address some of these shortcomings all across the program. And I'm anxious to hear from Mr. Curry how GAO believes that FEMA can prioritize these 50 open issues. And I also want to hear from the emergency management folks at the National Emergency Management Association and the International Association of Emergency Management. They are on the front lines, and they can tell us from their standpoint how they think things can be improved, how they are working well, and how we need to make some adjustments. So we'll look forward to the hearing. We thank the witnesses for being here. And I would now turn to Mr. Webster, the ranking member, for his opening statement. There you go. We can't hear you, Mr. Webster.
How's that?
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Chair. I just want to say FEMA has a mission critical to our nation, but also critical to the state of Florida, my home state. FEMA leads the federal government's response to disasters, natural and man-made. The FEMA processes are complicated and riddled with too much red tape, and it slows the preparation for the recovery from disasters and discourages investment in mitigation. Over the years, the committee has passed legislation intended to cut red tape, but these laws are rarely implemented, and so they're intended to be done, but they just don't get done. The Government Accountability Office has issued dozens of reports and many recommendations still open across a host of areas, including recovery, mitigation, and individual assistance. What seems to be the common theme throughout all of the report is how confusing and complicated FEMA's process can be. It's more critical than ever that a number of the disasters we are seeing for the process to be streamlined. We need to get assistance out the door quickly to allow communities and families to rebuild faster and easier, build in mitigation so next time there will be less damage. That's why I'm pleased to co-sponsor a bipartisan legislation, the Speed Recovery Act, introduced by Ranking Member Senator Graves, which will streamline the process for about 95% of the disasters that are happening. I look forward to hearing from GAO and the stakeholders here today and those submitting written testimony for the record. Thank you, Chair, and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. We now turn to the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Mr. DeFazio, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I certainly also want to congratulate Aaron on his new position. That organization is incredibly lucky to have him coming on board with his extraordinary breadth and depth of experience. He did start many years ago in my personal office on the Hill, and then, as you noted, moved on to many other important positions. And it's been great to have him on the committee, especially since I think he's the only person who can master all of the acronyms of FEMA. I don't think there is another agency of the federal government that has as many acronyms for as many programs. And I find it incredibly confusing, as I think many others do, but he can always explain it. So again, congratulations. We put obviously extraordinary burdens on FEMA recently with COVID, the border, and then we're having more and more extreme natural disasters, both wildfire, weather events that are exacerbated by climate change. And we have to help the agency streamline so that it can with more facility deal with this extraordinary burden that they have. We recognize that their budgets are stretched, and we also have to meet our obligations there. I was particularly interested in the National Emergency Management Association's thoughts paper on what we would do with wildfire response and recovery, particularly an incredible concern here in the Western US as we're now headed into the 20 some odd year of what's called a mega drought, the worst in recorded history if this winter continues the way it's going. And their comments about the FMAG, DRRA, HMGP, and WUI are very well taken, and I hope they'll amplify on those a little bit today as they testify. The other area of major concern beyond all of the outstanding issues with GAO are things that relate to personal assistance and the confusion there. We have to simplify these processes, and we also have to better integrate with other agencies that can be involved, including HUD or other disciplines. We still have people from the fires in Oregon who do not have long-term housing, and I'm concerned that they may soon have to be paying substantial rent for temporary quarters, and that's a subject of a letter recently sent. The chair and the ranking member mentioned legislation that's pending. I'm going to have to get off this probably pretty quickly because I have to go to a chair's meeting, and I'm going to raise the issue of when we're going to bring those bipartisan bills to the floor, as opposed to post offices and other things that we've been doing lately. So particularly the Resilient America package, I believe, would move expeditiously through the House. And I'm looking forward to that in the not too distant future. So with that, Madam Chair, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't believe that Mr. Graves is with us, so we will go right to our witnesses. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Welcome to our subcommittee. Our witnesses are Mr. Chris Curry, Director of Homeland Security and Justice with the U.S. GAO, Ms. Erica Borneman, Director of the Vermont Emergency Management, and also is testifying on behalf of the National Emergency Management Association, and Ms. Carolyn Harshman, who is the President of the International Association of Emergency Managers. We thank you for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written word will now be part of the record, we would kindly request that you limit your testimony to 5 minutes. So we'll begin with you, Mr. Curry. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus, Chairman DeFazio, and Ranking Member Webster for the chance to be here today to talk about GAO's work on FEMA priorities. First, I think it's important to recognize the pressures and the challenges that FEMA has on it. In recent years, the agency has led the pandemic response, responded to year after year of record-setting hurricanes and wildfires, and also been asked to help with other national issues such as border security. At GAO, even though we audit and evaluate FEMA, we also have respect for the hardworking staff and the mission. There's not a more dedicated group of federal employees, and also I've found FEMA leadership to be very committed to self-evaluation and improvement. Having said that, I see 4 key challenges that FEMA will have to tackle in the years ahead. First, as was mentioned in opening statements, is the workforce, managing its own people. The FEMA workforce is worn down by disaster season that really never ends anymore. Also, the agency's staffing, training, and hiring processes were designed for a mission that has changed. We've found that FEMA has long faced challenges in deploying staff with the right qualifications and skills to meet disaster needs. We've also found that FEMA struggles to train, coach, and develop its disaster workforce, especially when they're deployed in the field. For example, reservists who make up almost 40% of the workforce face barriers to getting the training and other developmental opportunities they need when they're not deployed, including not having paid time and technology to get training when they're not in the field. We've made recommendations to fix some of these problems, but I think broader workforce reform involving Congress and this committee is needed to be able to hire, train, and retain the staff FEMA needs to meet a growing mission. The second major challenge area is simplifying disaster relief and removing barriers for disaster survivors. We have found that survivors face a number of challenges in understanding and obtaining FEMA individual assistance. We recently made 14 recommendations in one report alone to improve the individual assistance program, including that FEMA overhaul and improve how it communicates award decisions or denials with survivors. We found that confusion doesn't just lead to frustration, it also led to some survivors not pursuing assistance when they may have been eligible to get it. The third area of challenge is streamlining and simplifying complex, lengthy recovery grants and programs for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. In our work, states, tribes, and other localities tell us over and over again that recovery programs are at best overly complicated and at worst actually a disincentive sometimes to recovery. According to FEMA, the agency had almost 1,000 open disasters or emergency declarations going back years, including Hurricane Katrina in 2005. While most think of FEMA staff as immediately responding to a disaster, the truth is that much of FEMA's workforce manages thousands of grants and recovery projects from prior disasters. Streamlining recovery programs to be more efficient would help cut down on FEMA's workload, and going back to the staffing issues I talked about, help the staff focus on the most pressing matters. Also, coordination between FEMA, as Chairman DeFazio said, and other federal recovery programs like HUD and SBA and others would further cut down on the burden and frustration that states and communities face. Further compounding the challenges related to complexity, concerns are also being raised now about the extent to which disaster assistance programs are helping those most in need and how they impact vulnerable populations as well. The last and fourth key priority area is building resilience. This is an area that FEMA has made tremendous progress on in recent years, partly due to Congress's actions too, to create new programs. Mitigation and building resilience is one of the few solutions that we have to adapt to extreme weather and severe infrastructure damage. Additional pre-disaster mitigation grants like the BRIC program, the Building Resilient Infrastructures program, will help to address these issues, but FEMA needs to continue to focus on ensuring these grants encourage mitigation. We just reported last year that state and local officials told us that mitigation grant programs were still too lengthy and complicated, making them even more difficult to use effectively than some other grant programs. This completes my statement. I look forward to discussing how we can address these challenges and your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curry. We'll now go to Ms. Borneman.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Titus and Ranking Member Webster for this hearing today. And I would be remiss if I missed out on acknowledging Chairman DeFazio of the full committee. Your retirement is bittersweet for the emergency management community. Your steadfast leadership during your time at the helm of the T&I committee has truly been impactful to the profession. Your retirement is well earned, and we really wish you the best. Fortunately, the current leadership of the committee will remain intact for the coming year. And however, there are several areas that state emergency managers feel we can be effective in working with FEMA and Congress. The most recent iteration of the FEMA strategic plan is thoughtful and demonstrates real commitment to the next generation of emergency management. As we look forward toward managing an ever-changing climate, instilling equity both in programs, diversifying our workforce, and ensuring the nation has the highest level of readiness, there are several issues on which we should focus. Emergency managers are in need of policies and regulation that provide more flexibilities to navigate increasingly complex challenges faced in a rapidly changing environment. Threats such as the ongoing pandemic, cybersecurity, climate change, infrastructure failures, and continuing natural hazards require a streamlined and coordinated federal approach. As the complexity of the disasters we respond to and recover from increases, so do programs that were meant to aid Americans in their worst hour. NEMA recently completed work on 3 position papers, which Chairman DeFazio referenced in terms of the wildfire one, which I have submitted for the record with my written statement. They address the need for greater collaboration on establishing grant requirements, enhancing coordination between FEMA and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and addressing wildfire policy. You may remember back in November when my colleague from Oregon, Andrew Phelps, testified before this committee on wildfires. NEMA took advantage of this opportunity to participate in that hearing and codified in policy many issues that were discussed. I request your attention to the recommendations provided in that position paper, and we really look forward to working with the committee as we look for opportunities for implementation. Wildfires are just one hazard that highlight the need for further examination of the equity of application and implementation of disaster programs. Small changes in policy or statute can equal significant impact when measuring results. A small step such as implementing a universal application for disaster survivors is a seemingly simple measure that equates to better access for states that may have less resources and a better disaster survivor experience. We remain encouraged by FEMA's forward-leaning approach to garnering feedback for preparedness grant programs and expect clear objectives to be outlined to address known equity challenges within the program themselves. Beyond equity, however, there are many other challenges in response and recovery programs. For several years now, practically every NEMA witness before this and other committees has spoken of the need to simplify federal programs, to streamline state management, and make them more accessible to the public. This doesn't require broad measures. It can be simple steps, such as clarifying FEMA as the lead federal agency for all consequence management, supporting legislation such as the Speed Recovery Act, which raises the small project threshold, reviewing the authorities, roles, and responsibilities of the consolidated resource centers to ensure they're not overly bureaucratic, and allowing for the rollover of management costs from one disaster to the next, thereby building capacity at the state level and speeding disaster closeout. Finally, the changing face of disasters means we must consider challenges such as our changing climate. Unfortunately, current programs lack adequate guidance and support to address all hazards intensified by climate change. FEMA needs to strategically identify, prioritize, and invest in climate resilience projects that help reduce future losses. This should be done also with an eye toward measurable outcomes so we know what success looks like. These goals are not unattainable, and the state emergency management community believes that working together across all levels of government, we can make preparedness and disaster programs more accessible and accountable. On behalf of the entire NEMA membership, thank you again for holding this hearing, and I look forward to any questions you have with me.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to our last witness. Ms. Caroline Harshman.
Yes, good afternoon. Committee Chairman DeFazio, Subcommittee Chairwoman Titus, Ranking Member Webster, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Carolyn Harshman, and I'm a certified emergency manager and the very proud president of the International Association of Emergency Managers. IEM is a professional organization comprised of dedicated emergency management practitioners who wake up every day thinking about and planning for natural and human-caused emergencies. As the profession of emergency management continues to shake off the Chicken Little stereotype of days gone by, we are benefiting greatly from the abundance of higher education programs and graduates. The usefulness of our profession was infinitely clear during the early stages of COVID-19 as we coordinated organizations and resources to adapt to the evolving needs of our communities. In the meantime, the frequency of disasters and ever-present changes in climate are increasing the numbers of people and property impacted by hazards. I see us standing at the crossroads now as the ravaging days of the pandemic begin to wind down, and we're seeing a range of emergency managers emerge from a broad spectrum of industries and disciplines. With that expansion and emergency management protocols becoming more and more politicized, the profession needs strong guidance that will ensure we forge the best path forward. FEMA's strategic plan could not have come along at a better time. In order to be effective emergency managers, it's imperative that we treat all of the members of our communities as equals. All politics, income levels, socioeconomic standing, and other polarizing characteristics need to be set aside in order to ensure equitable delivery of services in a community's greatest time of need. FEMA Strategic Plan number 1 instills equity as the foundation of emergency management. I began my career in emergency management with the County of San Diego back in the 1980s. I transferred into the position from the Regional Planning Department, where I worked as a land use planner, processing subdivisions, facilitating community plans, and preparing the county's first water conservation ordinance. Writing the ordinance nudged me into realizing we don't live in a limitless environment and that the negative impacts have the greatest effect on the most impoverished. As a budding emergency manager, I took my knowledge of demographics and quickly saw patterns of inequity well aligned with the region's hazards. Public service announcements regarding the storage of food and water were only dreams to the families struggling to live day to day. Equally ineffectual were the culturally insensitive deliveries of emergency food supplies. Emergency managers need tools in order to better understand the cultures and realities of the communities they serve. Strategic Plan number 2 inspires emergency managers to lead the whole community in matters relating to climate resilience. Like the water conservation I mentioned earlier, emergency managers must work hand in hand with planners, engineers, and fire professionals to create a better built environment. As new and redeveloped construction projects are considered by a jurisdiction, it is very rare for an emergency manager to have a say in whether or not a project should be approved. Instead, the enforcers of codes and ordinances conduct reviews to determine whether or not a project conforms. Building better in the first place will eliminate the need for spotty retrofits and other incremental solutions. Most importantly, solidifying relationships will bring the enforcers into mitigation planning and open the door for emergency managers to participate in climate adaptation plans and other programs aimed at climate resilience. Strategic Plan Goal number 3 promotes and sustains a ready FEMA and prepared nation. These actions will greatly strengthen emergency management community capacity. At present, many of our emergency managers wear multiple hats: administrators, first responders, and other officials. The same is true for our non-governmental organizations, where the emergency manager is also the risk manager, safety officer, and in charge of environmental compliance. Any and all of FEMA's efforts to standardize training plans and exercises will be well received, especially by those struggling with multiple hats. Equally important is the need to train and empower individuals and community groups to serve as force multipliers, as we recognize the potential and willingness of our citizens to actively engage in an emergency's initial response. In closing, the USA Council of IAM is 5,100 members strong and already working very hard within its 25 committees and caucuses to share ideas and develop new solutions for our members and the communities they serve. We stand ready to contribute to the success of FEMA's new strategic plan. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I think we see some themes emerging based on the statements that we made earlier and some of your observations and those reports that have been issued by FEMA. We'll now go to Chairman DeFazio, who has to leave us to ask questions first.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yes, actually, I'm going to have to depart momentarily for the chair's meeting, but I was informed by Chief of Staff Kathy Dedrick that we think we'll have an opportunity next month to bring that legislation I mentioned earlier to the floor. So that will be good. But beyond that, I want to just say this is great testimony, and you've given us an awful lot of things that we have to think about and deliver on. I think the most difficult is going to be some coordination that was mentioned by GAO and I believe implied by the others between SBA, HUD, and FEMA, and that's that's I guess our job to work with those other committees. And I don't think I have to ask a question on that. I do want to ask quickly. One of the issues that GAO noted was high staff turnover, which has led to a lack of expertise and delayed recovery. And what do you think accounts for that? Is it just burnout because it's so constant, or what other issues could we address that would help mitigate that? I'd ask Mr. Curry from GAO if he could.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, the good question. I think there's a number of things that account for the retention issues. Obviously, just the workload over the last few years, really starting in 2017 with Hurricanes Irma, Maria, and Harvey, just the back-to-back sequential nature, then followed by the wildfires you're aware of. There's no disaster season anymore. The whole year is disaster season. So that's really complicated FEMA's ability to plug people in nationwide where they're needed. But on top of that, I think there are some rules and some administrivia behind how they can deploy certain employees that complicates their ability to train and get them qualified and ready. For example, the reservists are part-time. They're only called up for a specific disaster, and they can only do training and development and get coaching when they're assigned to a disaster. And you can imagine as an employee, that's probably not the best time to be trained and get development. Part of that has to do with just the restrictions on only being able to use disaster relief fund money for a specific disaster. So I think that's one cause. But there's many other things like that I think, that's why I think it's really important that we need to look at FEMA workforce through a lens of comprehensive reform, similar to what was done years ago with the National Guard and the Military Reserve in terms of how we get them trained and ready for deployment.
Yeah, it's an excellent point regarding how we targeted certain National Guard units for the highest level of training to be ready to instantly deploy without really much any additional preparation. So that's an excellent point that I would hope FEMA should follow up on, and perhaps we can too. The other major concern is, for any of the panelists, yeah, I'll be, resilience, BRIC, and how we're going to do mitigation more quickly. And if anybody wants to address that quickly, that'd be great. Ms. Bornman, I see you moving around. Did you want to address that?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. That's definitely a challenge that we experience. Long periods of time between application submission and obligation. I won't horrify you with some of the timelines I have, but just take my word for it that they are very long, and you can what we call it getting RFI'd to death, receiving sequential requests for information for clarifying a certain application, just really overly complicated. We have to accelerate climate adaptation, and we have an opportunity with BRIC and the Hazard Mitigation Program. The award under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program under the COVID-19 disaster declaration was just an amazing opportunity. But we can't, we have to do our work at the state level to develop those projects, but we also have to have the trust that FEMA is resourced and ready to be able to turn around obligations on those projects quickly. That comes down to staffing and understanding and training around the regulations and making sure that the regulations have evolved to reflect the hazards that we have in front of us today. That's not just flooding, although flooding is a large one, but it's about the hazards posed by wildfire, by drought, and so many others, in making sure that we have the tools available to us to be able to mitigate those hazards.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Thanks to all the panelists. My time has expired and I've got to go to this other meeting. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. All right, we'll now recognize Mr. Webster, ranking member. I can't hear you, Mr. Webster. I don't know if anybody else can or not.
Maybe now.
Yep,
How's that?
that's better.
Okay, Ms. Borman, you had mentioned in your opening remarks a bill, House Bill 5641, speed recovery, and sponsored by, I'm a co-sponsor of that, but it was sponsored and introduced by Ranking Member Sam Graves, which raises the small projects threshold to $1 million. And can you talk a little more about how raising that threshold can reduce the complexity of projects and maybe speed up recovery?
Yes, sir, I can. So the right now we have different categorizations between small projects and large projects, and small projects can be managed at the state level, but the threshold for those projects is relatively low. And when you look at especially larger disasters, you can actually have multiple small projects within one jurisdiction, which just becomes administratively burdensome. And so raising the small project threshold allows the states to utilize their management costs that are a part of that disaster declaration to be able to manage those more effectively. We know the terrain, we know the people, we know the contacts, and so often we're able to move those projects along to close out a little bit quicker. FEMA just is a large bureaucracy, and so they're trying to manage project by project. If we raise the large project threshold, that means FEMA can spend their time doing the more complicated projects that are larger, and they can potentially have some cost savings around the time that they spend doing all of the administrative pieces for small projects. I want to highlight, though, it's really important. We very much support raising the small project threshold, but it's also really important to have a measure that will allow us to carry over management costs from disaster to disaster. I'll just raise the example of Vermont. I think we have like 10 or 11 open disaster declarations in a very short period of time. We have disasters quite often here, but we're only able to use management costs for that specific disaster, and that doesn't allow us to build any capacity or sustaining capacity over a number of years that's already right-sized because it's only based on the size of the disaster. So if we're going to be able to raise the small project threshold, we really want to try and also be able to carry over management costs that will give us the capacity to do that additional management of small projects.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Curry, the statistics GAO cites relative to the percentage of FEMA the workforce and the training they've had are a little bit concerning. And I was wondering, is there something we can do to get the training information they need so it would be more a part of the solution than the problem? Can you talk more about your recommendations for FEMA workers?
Yes, sir. Well, the challenge in the past has been that, and what we've found is that FEMA has struggled for years. It has a system of qualifying its employees. It has almost 20,000 people that are available to deploy to a disaster. And so they have a system that qualifies each person at a certain level in a certain area. And then they use that to deploy around the country wherever they're needed. The challenge has been that that system has not always been that reliable for indicating a person's readiness or their experience level to go staff a disaster. So they get in the field and they're not ready and they're not able to do the job as well. And we heard this directly from FEMA field leadership too, the people that manage the disaster. So, you know, what we've recommended internally is they take a number of steps to try to clean that up and get better information so they can make better staffing decisions real time. But I think it's important to say that I think there needs to be a more holistic look at the entire workforce structure and what authorities and legislation might be needed to overhaul that. The truth is the mission today and the pace is totally changed. The current workforce was designed for 20 years ago, and it's just a different world today. And the workforce is not going to be able to meet the mission that's expected of it unless we look at it as a whole.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. I'm glad you brought up the Speed Recovery Act, and we've mentioned it several times. That was a bill that I was pleased to work on with Mr. Graves and you, Mr. Webster, and Chairman DeFazio. It shows that bipartisan efforts can work, and we've done a good job of that on the committee. I was also glad to hear Mr. DeFazio bring up about how we should perhaps look at FEMA and training and deployment like we look at the National Guard. I've been hearing, I heard you, Mr. Curry, say that was a good idea. I've been introducing this bill and talking to former heads of FEMA and everybody I can about treating these reservists like we do treat the National Guard and providing them with some employment security. Seems like that would just help a lot to recruit and retain people if they don't have to go off and work on a disaster for 4 months and then come back and can't get their job. I wonder, Mr. Curry, if you could address that, if you support that notion, if you think it would help, and if we should move on with legislation to that effect.
Yes, ma'am. I think that securing their employment would need to absolutely be a piece of any sort of workforce reform. So absolutely, I think you would have to look at that, particularly in this day and age nationwide, we face a challenge. Everyone's having trouble getting workers and people to work for them. And FEMA's that they're part of that too. So I think that needs to absolutely be part of any sort of reform effort.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear you say that, because I'm going to come with that legislation again, and I welcome all the members of the committee to sign on to it. Maybe we can get at least that one little piece done. Another thing that I would ask all of you is, when we talk about FEMA and these programs, we act like we're operating in a vacuum, but we really aren't. There's a lot of politics that surround this. And a lot of that is related to accepting climate change and how to address climate change and whether climate change even exists or not. I would ask the two representatives from associations if you have similar problems like that among your members. And if you do, how do you try to address it or get beyond it?
This is Carolyn. For several years, because of the politicized aspects of climate change, we didn't have a caucus or a working committee that was tasked with that. The effects of climate change were built into things like flood control and other caucus areas that we did spend a lot of time on. And just recently, over the last couple of years, we do have a dedicated group that is looking specifically at climate change. We also have a new mitigation caucus that includes climate resilience and adaptation. And so I think that as the gates are sort of being lifted on some of the political sensitivities, the association is definitely standing up, and there are lots of our members eager to be working towards a solution, and really delighted that they've been able to be, let free to be able to maybe write ordinances, help jurisdictions prepare climate adaptation plans and things like that. One of the things that I'd like to mention, it kind of ties over a couple of the other subjects that we've been touching on. And part of what I alluded to in my presentation is that as a recovering land use planner, I can tell you that after working in that field, planners are not trained on hazards. There's one little piece of the general plan that talks in the safety element that talks about if you have earthquake faults and you're prone to tornadoes and things like that. But planners don't really perceive that they have responsibility for doing anything about that. And as a result, it just gets passed off to the emergency manager, who now has to clean up the mess. And so I think until we really address that sort of elephant in the room, we'll continue to have two professions that should be more closely aligned, and instead they hardly know each other exists.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point. Ms. Borneman?
You know, in the past couple of years, NEMA has reorganized ourselves as well. We have several policy committees that just take a real focused look at different areas of the field. And last year, our previous president created the Resilience Committee, recognizing that there needed to be a focused effort on hazard mitigation, but also climate adaptation. You know, when we look at the emergency management of the future, hopefully I'll be still doing this in 30 years. In 30 years, I expect that the disasters and hazards that that we're presented with today will likely be they will be different. When we talk with emergency managers throughout the country, it is in front of their face. Climate change is in front of their face, especially anybody that's been doing this for a period of time. They see the change right in front of them. And so honestly, we don't see politics play into some of the planning and work that we do, because it's right there. And there's really just no denying it, but we're very focused on how we can adapt to climate change.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. These discussions shouldn't be ideological. They should just be based on science and facts. It sounds like that's what your two associations are doing. I may come back to ask about how the three levels of government, as well as the different agencies horizontally, can coordinate better. But at this point, I'll go to, let's see, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And first, want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I want to take the few moments that I have to talk a little bit about the FEMA Mitigation Bout program, and specifically how these programs impact rural America. Mississippi and other rural states often struggle to get local governments and our citizens to participate in the FEMA Mitigation Bout program. So we know that these programs are extremely successful. These programs result in the avoidance of future damages. I think studies have shown that for every dollar that is spent on land acquisition, we avoid roughly $5 in future damages, particularly those damages that would be caused by things such as flooding. But when looking at these programs, we know that the FEMA Bout programs are weighted more heavily toward urban communities. And that's the reason is because often we see in these urban communities that we see the mitigation is often streamlined through larger resources at the local level. I think there were some statistics I saw that showed roughly 75% of mitigation bouts have occurred in urban communities and only 25% in rural communities. And the average completion of these projects can often be extremely lengthy in nature. I think it's approximately 5 years for the completion of these mitigation bout programs. And so under the current FEMA bout system, it seems that we are unintentionally underserving some of our rural and low-income areas. The current structure, which reimburses local governments, benefits the high revenue areas because they can afford to take on the debt and they can afford to hold that debt until the lengthy process of reimbursement occurs. We've also seen recently private companies that specialize in mitigation practices are frequently being utilized by both state, local, and the private sector to quickly and efficiently complete mitigation strategies, and often do so at a lower cost. So my question, and I'll start with you, Mr. Curry, and then ask others if they would like to weigh in. As we'd like you to provide your thoughts on public-private partnerships, how we can best utilize the P3s to conduct mitigation bouts, to do so in a more efficient way, and to see that we are best spending FEMA dollars. And specifically, if you can talk about how those relate in rural America, where the reimbursement structure and cost sharing of these programs are at times counterproductive to participation in the programs themselves.
Thank you, Congressman. Great question. I think you set that up really well. I mean, first thing I'd say is buyout programs, like all mitigation programs, are incredibly complicated, and there's a really complex process. Unlike building infrastructure and making it more resilient, there's a whole sort of local political process you have to go through with the buyout, all sorts of studies, cost benefit evaluations, things like that. It makes it very, very difficult to do. First of all, even for large urban communities, but you take rural communities, it's all about an issue of capacity and funding, which you set up. These are already difficult. So which communities are going to be less likely to be able to navigate that process and have the resources to do it? It's going to be rural communities, poorer communities, vulnerable communities, things like that. So I could not agree more that these programs are incredibly technically complicated, and even more so for rural and small communities.
Would any of our other witnesses care to kind of weigh in on these programs, particularly the relationship that they have to some of our rural communities, and the fact that it makes it much more difficult for rural communities to participate in programs which are very, very beneficial? I think the benefit of these programs are clearly proven. No one is trying to say that these programs don't in the long run save dollars, because clearly they do. But are there any ideas that members of this panel have as to how we can make these programs more accessible and include more rural communities in these types of programs that FEMA has to offer?
Yes, sir. As you probably know, the state of Vermont is a very rural state. And we really appreciate when we're able to exercise flexibility within the hazard mitigation programs. We need to have a maximum flexibility to be able to apply these programs in a way that fits the jurisdictions within our state. In Vermont, for example, at the state level, we utilize contract support and make it available to local jurisdictions that don't have the resources to contract for those resources themselves. I don't have enough money to put hazard mitigation planners in every single jurisdiction. I'd love to, but we do utilize some contract support and leveraging those public-private partnerships to make that available on behalf and to local jurisdictions. I would say the level of FEMA scrutiny and micromanagement on some of these hazard mitigation projects is just crushing sometimes, especially when you're a community of 2,000 people. That's where I live. I live in a community of 2,000 people, and they just don't have the capacity to be able to manage a project like that. Yet they're getting repetitive damage every other year or every year. Making measured changes to the hazard mitigation grant program to treat it more like a block grant and give states a little bit more flexibility to be able to apply the same hazard mitigation guidance and the same intent of the law, but at the state level, and being able to apply it utilizing that support at the state level would be really beneficial.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired.
Oh.
Okay. Well, now we've got Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I appreciate this important hearing on FEMA's priorities, and I particularly appreciate our witnesses and their testimony. It's been very useful. My first question is for Mr. Curry. I noted a New York Times article in June 2021 that reported that white disaster victims and communities receive more aid from FEMA than people and communities of color, even when the amount of damage to their homes and property is the same. I was befuddled by that. Mr. Curry, how does GAO's December 2021 recommendation to FEMA on improving the process for identifying potential barriers to access racial inequality? No, I'm phrasing that wrong. How does GAO's December 2021 recommendation to FEMA on improving their process for identifying potential barriers to access take racial inequality into account?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. So what we looked at in that report is we went out to answer that question and see to what extent FEMA, not just FEMA, but SBA and HUD too, look at the outcomes of their programs to see who they're affecting and how they're affecting different groups. What we found is that none of the agencies really collect the kind of data on the outcome to really identify what the barriers are for certain communities. And that's a problem, because if you don't collect the data, then you can't measure it. And you certainly, if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. But we've also identified a number of barriers in FEMA's process for individual assistance that apply to everybody, but particularly probably land harder on communities of color and vulnerable populations. For example, the individual assistance program, the one you register for when you're a survivor of a disaster, is incredibly complicated and confusing to survivors. I'll just give you one example. The letters that FEMA provides when somebody registers of whether they're going to get assistance often will say denied or not eligible. Even if the person may be eligible, they just need to provide additional documentation or additional information or wait for insurance to pay out and things like that. So all these things, there's a lot of other examples I have in the process, and all these little things are disincentives. You know, when you get a communication like that from the federal government, it doesn't incentivize people to continue on. So the burden is on the survivor to keep pulling from FEMA, give more information. And ultimately, some of them just stop trying to get the assistance. So I think we've made a number of we think it needs to be much more simple for survivors and integrated across agencies. And the burden shouldn't be on the survivor to prove, for months and months that they're eligible for the assistance.
So have you made it more simple?
We're working on it. We've made, in that one report on individual assistance, we made 15 recommendations to FEMA on different parts of their process. Now, what they've said is they're working on all those things and they're re-engineering the program completely. So they're tackling it step by step, but it's complicated. And as you know, Congresswoman, they don't move quickly. I think they get it. They understand the problem, and you see it in their strategic plan. You see it in the new administrators committed to equity. But like anything else, you're not going to fix a problem that was created over many years overnight. But I think they're on the right track. But continued oversight of them to make sure they do it, not just talk about it, it's key.
It certainly is. Ms. Borman, in your testimony, you stated that, and here I'm quoting you, layering additional grant requirements to address equity concerns can become an equity issue by applying a one-size-fits-all approach to all states, end quote. Could you please explain to me in what way adding equity requirements to a grant application might create racial inequality issues?
Yes, ma'am. So the point being made there is that the more complex a system or a grant is to access makes it inherently an equity issue, because the folks with the greater resources have the ability and resources to be able to access those grant programs and to meet the grant requirements. And the folks that don't have the resources, maybe from a rural community, maybe from historically underprivileged communities, you know, they don't necessarily have the resources to be able to meet those grant requirements. We've talked a lot about this within NEMA and addressing where equity in equity, I know that is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit, but where grant programs are more complex and have additional requirements can actually be a barrier to entry. And therefore, if we can identify them, then we can address them. And that's really what the point was there.
Well, how would you propose to streamline federal and state emergency collaboration?
I think if you can answer that briefly, but the time has expired.
Well,
I could keep you here all afternoon.
Okay, well, we better not then. We better go on to Mr. Jimenez and we can come back to that later.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just find this conversation fascinating, being that I was the emergency manager for the city of Miami during Hurricane Andrew. And one of the comments was that, 20 years ago, that maybe they did things really well. I don't think they did things really well 20 years ago, back during Hurricane Andrew. And it took us in the city of Miami and then later in Miami-Dade County, it takes over a decade to close out an account, which is crazy. And so I guess my questions are, yes, I'm gonna make comments. Okay, number one, the forms need to be a lot easier. We need to, the problem I think is that the forms are made out by the people, we started out with all these acronyms, right? The forms are made out by the people inside the agency, not really for the people that are the customers. So I'm wondering, do you have focus groups every time you put out a form and say, do you understand what this form says? Something as simple as that. Anybody from FEMA? Anybody? When a form is produced, do you actually go out to the customer and find out if the form is actually understood by the customer? Right.
Sir, I'm not from FEMA, but I just want to, I do want to note that, there are oftentimes where NEMA, the National Emergency Management Association, will have opportunity to provide comment and to provide feedback on the accessibility of, policies and different program changes. But that's a really excellent suggestion, and definitely something I'd like to take back to our organization to take a look at as well.
And by the way, don't use your people either, because your people understand FEMA a lot better than most people do. And so right. you need to go to the public and say, I have this form. We wanted to do this. Do you understand it that it wants to do this, or you think it's something else? Because a lot of these forms are really intimidating, especially if they come from the federal government. Second thing is, we need to make this a heck of a lot easier. And maybe my idea would be to empower the states more, empower the counties more, to be more accountable to the process, and to actually be more like a block grant that's given. You get an estimation of what the damages are, and then you give a block grant to these states of what they actually need, and then they have to justify it at the end, not so much this process and all these hoops that we have to go through. By the way, at the end, it's going to cost us more because it takes us so many years to actually put out a process and to get something built or rebuilt, that all these prices just keep escalating. And so the process that FEMA has, today is just, astronomical. Does anybody know how much FEMA spends on administrative overhead? I'll bet you it's a lot. Okay, and maybe that money would be better spent in other ways, and push this thing down to the states and to the locality. As an end user, I can tell you that FEMA was one of the most burdensome, bureaucratic agencies that I've ever dealt with, and that's not a good testament either to the localities or to the people who are trying to. These people have already gone through enough, and now we're making them go through another disaster, which is called go through trying to get the money out of FEMA. That's going to really You thought the hurricane was bad. This is going to be worse. And that's what I found during my time as mayor and emergency manager down in South Dayton. And so like I had a bunch of comments. I really don't have too many questions. So with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jimenez. We'll now go to Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of comments to make. I've been listening to this very intently, and I have several concerns. One is we now have 365 days a year fire alarms in California. And I understand that about 40% of the FEMA employment declined deployment to California, which leads me to believe that you have a problem with personnel. It's low morale, the burnout. So what are you doing about getting new candidates for employment, and where are you looking for them? And is the training sufficient? And what about the training? The training is different as it is in the East for hurricanes. California has fire, floods, earthquakes, and the heat because of climate change. So what are you doing to promote better employees with training, more employment for people who want to work for FEMA? And where are you doing such a thing? Mr. Curry.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So at GAO, we've looked at a number of things related to FEMA's workforce and wildfire. So let me kind of take that one by one. So on the training issue, I think they have faced challenges trying to get their folks qualified and trained at the level they need to be effective in their deployments. So we've made a number of recommendations behind the scenes to try to address that issue. Earlier, we talked about there needing to be more comprehensive reform around making sure we can train people before a disaster so they're ready to go after a disaster. I do want to say something about the wildfires, though, because I think you make a really good point. Prior to 2017, wildfires were common, but what was happening is FEMA disaster declarations for a wildfire were not as common. So after 2017, there's been a ton of them where the FEMA programs now are being used to respond and recover to wildfires in the Western United States and other parts of the country too. The problem is that everything in a wildfire is different. The response and the recovery programs, they don't work the same for a wildfire as they do for a flood or a hurricane. And this is something we reported on a couple of years ago and recommended that FEMA really look at all its programs to figure out what it needs to do to tailor these programs to better fit wildfires. For example, housing after a disaster. After a wildfire, the house is gone, and it's going to be gone for a long time. So how and where you house folks is totally different than how you might house people after a flood when the structure may be intact and they're able to use a mobile unit or something else like that. So I think there's a lot of work needs to be done tailoring these programs more specifically to wildfires as well.
Well, I have a great concern of mental health of the employees because if they are overburdened or burnt out, they certainly need some help. What do you do to the employees who need mental health service?
So what FEMA has told us that they're doing is they're trying to stagger these deployments for people so they have a break. So what was happening in 2017, for example, there were some people that deployed to Hurricane Harvey, then deployed immediately to Hurricane Irma, then immediately to Hurricane Maria, then immediately to the California wildfires. And so what they've tried to do since their disaster season, there's no season anymore, it's all year, is to try to factor in these breaks to give people some downtime, but also continue, hiring more people and getting more people trained so they don't have to keep redeploying the same people is a part of that as well.
Well, I wondered if you let us know or have FEMA let us know if you are conducting any recruitment so we can notify our colleges and universities of the employment opportunities. Certainly, I am concerned about the low morale. And you're right, it's being out without a break certainly could have an impact on them. Well, does FEMA talk to the other agencies on a regular basis, or is this something that is just catch as cat can?
This is an area that we've also identified as a challenge. You know, FEMA, as we've talked about, has its own very complicated programs, but for a state or a locality, they're often absorbing a number of other very complicated federal programs from HUD, from SBA, from other Treasury, other agencies. There is some informal coordination, but unfortunately, the programs are not synchronized and harmonized in a way that makes them easier to use. In fact, oftentimes what we hear from states and localities is that it just exponentially increases the complexity when more agencies are involved.
Well, they need to keep each other in touch of their own rules and regulations so they can talk in tandem. Thank you, Madam Chair. My time is up.
I know that Mr. Graves is concerned about that when it comes to HUD coordination. We'll hear from him here in a minute, I know. And when you go to recruit at college campuses, we want to be sure that you're going to our historic Black colleges and minority serving institutions so we can help to build a diversity in that workforce. Next, we have Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the hearing today. FEMA is always a key issue, especially in our Western states issues as well. But, you know, a lot of chatter about climate change, every committee, every conversation. Yet we suffer out here with forests that are not managed. We had a 1 million acre Dixie fire just last year and several other fires in the 6-digit range. And as well as the Camp Fire in Paradise was a big one. I'll be talking about that in a moment here. Yeah, we can hardly get the Forest Service and others to get out of their tracks to actually manage the lands in a way that will give us some way to battle fire and contain fire much more easily. So it's talk on one side, but not much action. But Forest Service has time this week to go down and shoot cattle from helicopters in New Mexico. They managed to find time to do that. Pretty freaking amazing. Anyway, to our folks in FEMA, when we look back at the Camp Fire in Paradise, there was an issue with post-fire where there was a lot of damaged trees, dead trees, blackened trees that were left behind, because I think FEMA really had a lot of practice with those protocols on what you do with still standing trees and treating them as debris. So you had many, many acres in an area that were still considered dangerous and left behind. So we were able to update those policies and get the debris cleaning to apply to more of those trees, which was helpful. So I appreciate that effort. But it did take a lot of effort with local groups, local inputs about these kinds of realities in after wildfire, et cetera. So what it really underlined is that we need FEMA to have more flexibility to adapt to situations and not have a slowdown in bureaucracy and check-in forms. You know, it's been alluded to several times in this conversation. So let me toss that out to Ms. Borman and Ms. Harshman about some of the things that FEMA could be doing and how our committee might be able to help to be more flexible in disaster response and you know, not just having to deal with forms and checking boxes, but immediate needs. Because what we're talking about is in the situation with housing post the Camp Fire in Paradise and other ones, is that getting the FEMA trailers that were sometimes, well, indeed needed in this case and in other fires. It took a lot. It was a lot of difficulty with that. So please allude to what we can do to increase the flexibility and still have accountability on that.
This is Carolyn. Just a couple of quick notes on that. Some of the challenges that the local jurisdictions have, and the majority of our members are from local government jurisdictions, a variety of different government entities. A lot of the challenge that they have is when they're going to be reimbursed by FEMA or some other federal entity, that there's a fairly comprehensive purchasing process that they have to go through, and they have to get bids, and they can't just go through their regular hiring practices. And so
yeah, it's been very difficult to get the land set aside to do them on, and then the land has to meet a certain specification. Then it becomes horrifically expensive, or maybe flexibility on getting what's a temporary deal, usually a year and a half, 2 years. That's what we need.
True, and that's part of the challenge, is that some of the creative solutions the local jurisdiction might come up with, or the relationships that they have with maybe someone providing temporary housing or a school that's not being used for the next 2 or 3 years while it's going through redevelopment.
Are you bound by statute? Are you bound by statute from being able to do it that flexibly? Do you have to check boxes, so to speak, on that? Or is it, what slows that ability down to be a little more adept on that?
Well, and I'm sure Erica can speak to this as well. It's the federal regulations that are going to be reimbursed by the federal government, that there are purchasing requirements that are much more arduous than what the local jurisdiction usually does, which is typically a list of 3. They have vendor lists that they rely on for everything. They don't have to go to outside bidders in terms of outside of the state, outside of the county. So the regulations are very different because we're watching the federal government.
Is this something you see as a complaint across the board that makes it more difficult for FEMA personnel, makes their jobs more stressful? Because, we get the calls, people are frustrated or even angry, they're still living on someone's couch or in hotel space. Is this something that we could be helping to legislate with you to take the burden off you as well as get a better result for people?
Well, and I'm here to represent the Association of Emergency Managers and not FEMA. We certainly have many FEMA members.
Mr. Curry, can you jump in on that real quick? I'm sorry, the time is so short. Mr. Curry, can you jump in on it? Thank you.
Yes, sir. I think, and GAO, we evaluate FEMA. But this issue of housing and wildfire specific programs, it's been a challenge. First of all, FEMA's programs were typically used in the past for floods and hurricanes and things like that. Right. And so some options just don't make sense. And so part of this is just agency applications of the existing programs. A lot of these things are new. So for example, the Paradise Fire, housing was a huge challenge because first of all, you couldn't live near some of those locations because they were toxic. Right. And then second of all, when you tried to relocate people, you couldn't find housing because it was so expensive and there was no housing in the area. So they came up with campground options, as I'm sure you're aware of, as a secondary option. So part of this is that these programs were not really designed for these types of like urban wild interfaces that are just destroyed. And they need to be, given how many fires we're facing. And so that's what we've recommended is these programs that were designed for floods and hurricanes, they need to be tailored for the wildfire situation because these are not a surprise. I mean, it's not a surprise that we're going to have housing shortages in Northern California after a wildfire. So we need to pre-plan and prepare better.
Thank you.
That'd be helpful. Thank you. Appreciate that. And, though we had some fits and starts, FEMA really did listen to us and responded about as well as possible in the situation. So thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
All right, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for the witnesses. It's very, very important to all of us. Mr. Maloff and I share much of the problems that he just talked about in our current districts. Going forward, it seems to me that a lot of this questions that have been raised have to do with the bureaucracy, the rules, the regulations that FEMA has. About let's see, that would be 2013. This committee addressed some of those by establishing the 428 Alternate Procedures Program, presumably for the purpose of trying to provide flexibility at the local level. Some of that had to do with upfront funding by FEMA for the recovery programs and for the mitigation programs, so that the small counties, cities, and others who are unable to fund it themselves would have the money to do so. It really hasn't worked at all. And I'd like to get at it because it might be a solution to much of what we talked about here, giving the local governments the authority and the responsibility of putting the program together and the funding to do it. So let's go at this. Mr. Curry, if you would opine on this briefly, if you've studied it. If you have not, we tried to put this in legislation that you would study it. We may have to go back at that. And then I'd like to go to Ms. Borman as your view on the 428 programs.
Yes, sir. I'll answer that. So we've looked at the 428 several times, both in the context of the post-Sandy, Hurricane Sandy recovery in the Northeast, but also more recently in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And I think it's been a mixed story. What you said is absolutely right. I think the goal of that was to create a process where we could upfront, maybe in the first year, come up with a complicated cost estimate and then allocate the funding all at once and be done with the back and forth for a decade that we usually have. That's not been the case. For example, in Puerto Rico, frankly, sir, it's actually been more complicated, I think. We've spent 4 to 5 years trying to get to a cost estimate up front and all the work and engineering and technical work that's gone into that. And both sides, I think, have been really kind of hesitant to kind of come up with a final number. So just getting to that obligation up front has been incredibly difficult, let alone the stage where we're just actually going to start work on these projects and go back and forth to verify the cost. So frankly, I think we almost added a way more complicated part up front. That's not what was intended in the law, but I actually think this is something that gets more towards just FEMA execution of the law. I think the law was pretty clear in what it was trying to do. I just don't think it's been executed that way.
Thank you. Ms. Sportman?
I'm gonna speak from a little bit of experience here with 428 because Vermont implemented the first 428 project after SRIA right here in the office complex that I'm sitting in. It was a project that was in recovery from Tropical Storm Irene, which devastated Vermont in 2011. And you know what, it was successful here, but we have to say that the issue with the 428 procedure is that FEMA is generally very involved, and it speaks to what Mr. Curry just said. It was supposed to be a simple process to streamline public assistance, but if FEMA is going to be as involved as they are in developing the cost estimate and project management as with the regular public assistance process, most locals don't really want to take that gamble, and they don't want to close the door on recovery cost overruns that are pretty common when you're looking at recovery from a disaster, as well as trying to build back in a way that makes that structure or whatever you're trying to put back more resilient. It's a huge gamble, especially for rural communities. And so, you know, there may be ways that we can work together to make that legislation be in implementation what it was meant to be. But it's very risky for us.
It just seems to me that the fundamental problem is that the local government has to come up with a plan, engineering, construction, and then held to that number with no flexibility provided by FEMA. Is that correct?
That's the crux of the issue. And you know, when you are, especially when you're looking at large projects that are multi-million-dollar projects, it is very easy for the cost estimate in 2013 to look very different in 2018 when you're trying to close on that project.
Understood. And that's what change orders are all about in every construction project that I've ever seen over the last many, many decades. Change orders. So if there was a procedure that provided the flexibility on the cost or the change orders that might occur, could the 428 program resolve many of the issues that have been discussed here today?
Oh, that's a really good question,
Well,
sir.
we'll have to ask you to keep it brief because the time has expired.
Chair, we'll get at this. It's not going to go away. Thank you.
That's right. Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the witnesses, and I really appreciate you all having this hearing today. Dr. Curry, I'm curious if you could talk about some of y'all's recommendations related to disasterassistance.gov. I know you talked about this a little bit. We had numerous instances where we had folks that had applied for disasterassistance.gov. They were just denied, weren't given any reason. The reality is it wasn't a final denial. It was a lack of information or incomplete applications. There was not a process for these people to go back and amend applications. Has GAO made recommendations in terms of the user friendliness or just applicability of disasterassistance.gov?
Yes, sir, we have. We dove into the individual assistance process and the .gov interface to it, as you mentioned, and we found a number of challenges with usability in that process. You mentioned one of them. One of them was just how they communicate with the survivor through a letter that often says denied or ineligible. But that doesn't mean a denial. It could just mean, for example, that the person's insurance needs to pay first, or they need to provide more documents. But the effect of that's sort of chilling, because if you get a letter from the federal government that says denied, you're going to think denied. You're not going to continue the process. And that's what we found, is that people that could have been eligible maybe didn't even get the amount they would be eligible for, or didn't continue the process. And that's just one of many things.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And then something else I wanted to bring up, and I know the chair mentioned this earlier, and I know that Congressman Carter is also interested in it. That's right. I just called you out. You saw that, Troy? And so, but we've got this issue. Congressman Carter and I both have been dealing with constituents that have been just tremendously impacted from Hurricane Ida last year. And you've got the immediate assistance that may be available from SBA or FEMA, and then you've got HUD that comes in later on. I mean, look, we worked really hard to get funds included in the CR back in September for the 2021 disasters. HUD hadn't even allocated the funds yet. And as you know, allocation simply means you're going to get this much to the state, which then the states have to go through, do action plans, apply. So here we are, appropriated money in September. It's now February, and they haven't even allocated the funds. After they make the allocation, we're probably looking at, and I'm probably being generous, about 9 months before the state can actually start cutting checks. I mean, so these are meanwhile disaster victims. So can you just speak to kind of the handoff with the different agencies, whether it be SBA who starts, or FEMA, depending on the loan or grant situation, and then HUD, and if y'all have made recommendations about just stopping the federal government from continuing to victimize these people that are victims?
Yes, sir, definitely. And there's no better state than Louisiana to understand all the federal programs over the last few years.
You could have stopped at Louisiana. You could have stopped at Louisiana.
So yes, we pointed this out. So there's multiple levels of problems. I mean, there's problems within FEMA and its own programs and the timeframes and the different regulations, but then there's problems across the department. So I think what's key to understand is these programs were never designed to work together. They were all created separately. They're separate regulations. They have separate timeframes. They have separate execution. They have separate documentation requirements, not designed to work together. But they're used together in disasters routinely now. Used to be they weren't. Now they are. And so that's a problem that has to get addressed. But on the HUD issue, just one example. It's been bad in Louisiana, but I'll give you an example of Puerto Rico. Those funds, they haven't even really started to be spent yet from 5 years ago. It's taken that long to get a HUD rule and plan together and start executing the funding. So what we hear from states and locals is, how are we supposed to plan recovery projects, let alone invest in mitigation projects where even more complicated if we have no idea when we're going to get the money or if we're going to be able to use it together?
So I'm going to show you this. This is our Restore Louisiana website. We appropriated $1.6 billion, $1.7 billion in late 2016 and early 2017. Here we are over 5 years later, and this is how much they've made available to homeowners. $666 million out of $1.7 billion. 5 years later. I mean, this performance is inexplicable. And Madam Chair, I want to thank you. I know you had worked with us on the bill we did with Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, trying to help put this all under FEMA's roof. So that way, you have one agency that's out there doing more of the immediate and the long term and giving states a larger role. I know Mr. Rouser has a bill as well, and I just want to re-urge that we continue looking at this. I think it's a really important issue that we have seamless handoff and have our government stop re-victimizing some of these survivors or flood victims. And I apologize, the other two witnesses, we're going to be submitting questions for the record for you, but thank you for your participation. Yield back.
You're muted. Dina, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. That sounded so brilliant too. I'm sorry y'all missed that. I was just saying to Mr. Graves, we hear that the problems are coordination vertically and horizontally across agencies and among the different levels of government. They often find though that when people get in these silos, jurisdiction becomes so critical. Nobody wants to give up power, personnel, jurisdiction. You have to kind of break those down. So I'm committed to working with you, Mr. Graves, to continue to do this sort of work because I think that it's important and there's a lot of it ahead of us. We'll now go to Mr. Carter.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. I stand in concert with my colleague from Louisiana, my dear friend, Mr. Graves. You know, we oftentimes in the immediate aftermath of Katrina found ourselves tag teaming, fighting for Louisiana residents, asking, you know, what we thought and what we agree, and even later everyone agrees, were just very basic, simple questions of why so much red tape? Why insult to injury? Why adding more red tape and more difficulty to what's already a very difficult time for people? As Garrett mentioned, many times it was applications that were not completely filled out, or maybe a box that was not checked properly. And there was no appeal process to come back and fix it without us painstakingly getting involved and really getting people back to the table. Well, the fact of the matter is people who already been hurt by a storm should not have added insult by having a bureaucracy that swallows them up. So I've got a question. What steps can be done to help FEMA be more user-friendly, to take out some of the red tape and minimize some of the changing policies? We know our state and local governments are developing public policy projects, and we need to make sure that they dovetail and they work together and not cause further of a logjam. So can you share with me some thoughts on how FEMA could do a better job and how we might help them do a better job?
Yes, sir. It's Chris Curry.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
All right. I'll start quick so you have time. So I think that, first of all, the mindset and the culture has to change, that these programs need to be focused on service delivery and efficiency. And there was an executive order that the president issued in December focusing on federal government programs and improving service delivery. FEMA's disaster programs is one of them. But you can't just talk about it. You've got to get in there and you've got to pick apart these programs, look at every part of the process, look at the barriers that are within them. I mean, we've pointed out many of them in our reports. And then you need to completely re-engineer them and retrain the staff so there's a cultural shift in how they're run. You know, it's no different from how a business would want to shift its focus to customer service. That's what needs to be done program by program. And then across these departments, they need to look at how they can work together to streamline and harmonize these programs. It can be done with effective leadership. It's just got to be a priority.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Are there plans to do that? Because very respectfully, we have storms that come every year. They come stronger, they come faster, they come bigger, they come harder. And this is not new to us. And these kind of battles that we've had with FEMA, other federal agencies, it seems like we're having the same conversations every time. Some of the things are so basic and so elementary that it really should not require rocket science to move them. So I hear you that there shouldn't be more talk, there should be more action. Can you share with me some ideas that we can help facilitate that will become action items in advance of the next series of natural disasters?
Well, I think part of this is asking FEMA through oversight, through hearings like this, but also through, you know, requests for information or meetings or whatever, press them on specifics about what they're doing within these programs to break down some of these barriers. You know, it's great to implement some of these things in the strategic plan and talk at a high level about priorities, but you know, that takes a while to trickle its way down into the programs and into the people that run them. This requires a cultural change. You know, we have a number of recommendations on areas that they are working on. I think they do get it. They understand they need to, there's a lot of pressure on them to.
I'm not just dumping on them. I'm not just dumping because I think they have heard us and they have tried and they've made adjustments as we brought it to their attention. But some of the adjustments are so elementary that one, they should not have needed our intervention. But two, some of the changes appear to be partial and then they slip right back to the old way they were doing it. It needs to be memorialized in a policy change and not just, oh, the congressman called and therefore we fixed it. And real quickly before I go, because my time's going to be up, I asked this question before and I'm going to double down on it. As cyber attacks increase, is the GAO studying the potential for cyber attacks during a natural disaster? And if not, is there something that's going to be done that you're going to look into that? Because that's one step away from something that we can find ourselves in a very devastating position in the middle of a natural disaster, and some terrorist group decides to take advantage of an otherwise strained system. Have you given some thought to that? Are there some things going on that you can share with us?
Thank you, sir. I'm not aware of any study or any evaluation we've done of cyber attacks specifically during a natural disaster. We've done work on cybersecurity across all the agencies that would be involved in a disaster, but I will take that back and talk to our cybersecurity experts, and we can I can get back to you on our plans for that, or whether we need to work together to do that in the future.
I would definitely do that. I suspect that it's something that we should be concerned about, and suspect that there may be some work going on, and if we can collaborate among agencies to make sure that we have the best practices in place to be prepared, I greatly appreciate it. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, if you don't, just one point on what Mr. Carter just brought up, we had thousands of constituents that essentially got hacked. Somebody else applied for their disaster assistance, and then our constituents that were real disaster victims were blocked out. He made a great point.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Carter and Mr. Graves. We now go to Ms. Gonzalez Colon, who can certainly talk about this issue from her perspective in her district in Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and ranking member. And I think this is a timely hearing, and the witnesses that are sharing with us their expertise. And I was hearing Garamendi and Mr. Graves, and I cannot agree more. I know that beside the witnesses today, there are numerous stakeholders presenting written brief for the record, whose input I deeply will be appreciating them. But unfortunately, Puerto Rico has become too familiar with FEMA over the past 5 years, and the current COVID emergency, the 2019 and 2020 earthquakes, and of course, our top of the list, Hurricane Maria in 2017. And our recovery is on track to be one, if not the largest in FEMA's history. FEMA has allocated more than $41.6 billion and obligated $38.8 billion and outlaid $15.8 billion to the island. However, in 2020, 3 years after Maria, there's no permanent work has started yet. Major obligations for long-term infrastructure rebuilding only began being announced in late 2020, and today we're still in planning and having RFPs stages. So many of my constituents have expressed a lot of frustration with these delays and the risk of having clawbacks on already approved benefits. Greater agility and accountability are imperative. That's the reason bills like such as Mr. Graves' HR 539, the Preventing Disaster Revictimization Act, and my HR 2016, the Federal Assistance Coordination Act, are both passed the House already, and HR 2020, the Post-Disaster Assistance Online Accountability Act, need to be considered to address these issues. And I do have a lot of questions, but I know the time is difficult here. But my first question will be to Director Curry. In your written testimony, and happy to see you again, in your written testimony, you review that prior GAO findings on workforce issues and speed of disbursement. And in the report on recovery efforts in Puerto Rico of May of last year, you made two recommendations. First, that FEMA should, in coordination with the government of Puerto Rico and other federal agencies, identify the assets risks to the remainder of the recovery, including internal and external factors such as the capacity to carry out projects. And for example, taking into consideration if we have the resources to start and finish projects within a time limit, or if more time is needed. And the second one, that FEMA should identify potential actions to manage risk to the remainder of the Puerto Rico's recovery and continuously monitor those risks. My questions will be, what response or follow-up has there been to those recommendations? Second, would your office make such a follow-up? Should the committee require one, or should we require FEMA to report to us their response? Should the committee, as part of the ward, establish a timetable for FEMA to report what they're doing about those recommendations? I think those should be, direct questions, and I do have more.
Sure. Yes, I think that it would be a good idea to hold FEMA accountable to those recommendations. And let me just say that at GAO, we are very focused on the recovery in Puerto Rico. Almost 5 years later, September. We've done several reviews on it. We're starting up another one. I plan to go back to Puerto Rico next month. I've been there 5 times since Hurricane Maria. The federal government potentially is going to spend well over $50 billion there. So it is a huge priority for GAO. But not just from the amount of money that's being spent. I am very concerned about the long-term recovery. Congressman Graves made a good point earlier, and he said that it's one thing to get to money obligated, but that doesn't actually mean that money's being spent and shovels are working and projects are going. And my concern about the situation in Puerto Rico, unlike other states that have the funding and the upfront money, is that there's not going to be the capacity, the funding, and the people to do all of this work. We're having labor shortages across the entire country, and I think we're going to have huge challenges actually executing a lot of this work. So we stand behind those recommendations to FEMA. I think this needs to be a huge area of focus continuing in the future. And we're not going anywhere, ma'am. We're going to continue to focus on this and do oversight on it.
Thank you. I know my time has expired, but Madam Chair, I think we should look into that opportunity for the committee to ask for those responses for FEMA, including them in ward eyes if we need to. And I do have another questions for the record, and those are for FEMA, but I'll also submit it in written form. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you all the witnesses.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I think it's been very interesting conversation. There seems to be a lot of consensus among those who testified, as well as the members of the committee who were asking questions, but we've got a lot of work to do, but I think we'll be able to accomplish that and want to look at FEMA as it meets those requirements or suggestions that have been made by GAO. We can go back to Mr. Curry's 4 points. I think that summarizes very well what we need to work on. Most of it comes down to bringing FEMA into the 21st century. Changes we need to make in the workforce, doing away with the confusion and red tape, streamlining complex projects and working with all levels of government and all agencies of government, and finally building in resistance and mitigation to any kind of changes that we should make. So I look forward to doing that. I welcome any members of the committee to make suggestions, introduce legislation. You have my commitment. We'll try to work with the chairman of the committee to push some of this through, because as you heard from him early on, he's concerned about these things as well. COVID affected all of us. It's a national disaster. So you overlay that with wildfires, like Nevada's the driest and the hottest state in the country and getting worse. Tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, it's all there and it's coming faster and harder. So that's my commitment to you, and I appreciate you all tuning in this morning for the hearing. Now let me get my script here for the conclusion. While I'm doing that, I'd like to say that Erin has left us in good hands. I want to introduce our new staffer, who is Lauren Gross. She has a degree from Georgetown. She worked for Rick Larson's office and comes to the committee as a legislative assistant and will be our main person on the committee. So we welcome Erin. Excuse me. I'm looking for it here. Let me see what we have left to do. All right. That concludes our hearing. I want to thank, as I've already done, all the witnesses for their testimony. It's been very helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that you might have and might be submitted for the record in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Anybody got anything they want to say? All right, committee is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.